this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, as everyone here knows. This is just one in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2015, and on or before September 30th, 2016. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Harvey Epstein. Stephen Flax.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Sabeel Rahman.
Present.
Helen Schaub. Scott Walsh.
Present.
Sarah Williams Willard. Rachel Godsell, present. We understand that Harvey's running late and will be here, and we will seek his role when he arrives. The next meeting of this board will be a public hearing. In all, there will be 4 public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines. They will be held on the following dates, times, and locations. The first is Monday, June 8th at the Alabash Recital Hall at the Graduate Center, CUNY, 365 Fifth Avenue, between 34th and 35th Streets. That will begin at 2 and run ideally until 6. The next is Thursday, June 11th, 2015, at the Bronx Museum of Art, Lower Gallery, 1040 Grand Concourse. That will begin at 5 and run ideally until 8, although again, we'll of course stay until we hear all the testimony. The third is Monday, June 15th at Queensborough Hall, 12055 Queens Boulevard, room 200, beginning at 5, running ideally till 8. And the final, before the vote, is Thursday, June 18th at Brooklyn Borough Hall, the courtroom, 209 Droleman Street, beginning at 5 and running until 8. Directions to those hearings can be found on our website, nycrgb.org, in the About Us section, meeting schedule. You can sign up by calling the Rent Guideline Board offices at 212-385-2934, and there are copies of our meeting schedule here today. The final vote will take place on June 24th, beginning at 6 o'clock p.m. It will be held in the Great Hall at Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street, at the corner of 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. To the board members, in your folder, you'll find copies of the 2015 Housing Supply Report and the changes to the rent stabilization housing stock in New York City in 2014, both of which will be presented this morning by the RGB staff. Copies of the report are here today, and they'll be posted on our website after this meeting. In addition to these reports, there are 3 RGB staff memos in your folders regarding additional 2015 income INA study follow-up data, a request for information from the tenant and owner board members, and a follow-up analysis of hotel registration data. These memos were emailed to the members of the board prior to this meeting. After the presentation of the RGB reports, we'll hear from Max Weselcouch, the director of the Moelis Institute for Affordable Housing Policy at the NYU Furman Center, regarding their annual State of New York City's Housing and Neighborhoods Report. DHCR Commissioner Woody Pascal was scheduled to appear before the board today, but he sent a last-minute change in his schedule this morning, and he will not be here. He sent his apologies. To the extent that we have information that we sought to obtain from him during his testimony, we obviously can put that in writing, and they will respond. There's information that they are now, I think, that they have identified and begun to make available to us, but is in front of legal right now, I understand?
Yeah, there was a series of questions that the board sent to them, and apparently it's almost finished. So as soon as I get that, I will send that, email that to the board members. But they do plan on it, giving that to us.
And again, if after reading their responses we have any follow-up questions, obviously let's be thoughtful about what our questions are and make sure they're important to us, but if they are important to us, we should obviously email them again. Finally, all submissions received from May 2008 from owners, tenants, and public officials regarding this year's guidelines are also in your folders. All right, so why don't we hear from Danielle. You're presenting the Housing Supply Report.
Good morning. The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 20,483 building permits were issued in 2014 for dwelling units, an increase of 13.8%. The number of new housing units completed in 2014 fell to 11,867, a 6.4% decrease over the prior year. City-sponsored residential construction will add 8,797 new housing units to the residential stock, 57% of which are rehabilitation projects. Demolitions increased 17.7% to 1,513 in 2014, and there was an 82.5% increase in the number of units in co-op or condo plans approved in 2014 to 9,573 units, while the number of approved plans grew by 40.5%. The number of units constructed with 421A certificates decreased by 12.0% to 6,945. The number of units newly receiving J51 abatements or exemptions also decreased by 26.7% to 40,787. In addition, 12.2% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded, and the citywide vacancy rate was 3.45% in 2014. Preliminary findings from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the triennial survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public earlier this year. We presented HVS findings in our earlier income and affordability study, and we will report on data related to the city's housing stock for this presentation. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter-occupied. The HVS reports approximately two-thirds of the city's housing stock is renter-occupied, compared to 36.5% for the nation as a whole. New York City has more than 2.1 million rental units, and slightly less than half of those are rent-stabilized. Citywide, the New York City vacancy rate in 2014 was 3.45%. Vacancy rates varied by rent regulation status, with the HVS finding a tight market among pre-war stabilized units with a vacancy rate of 2.29% in 2014. Post-war stabilized units also maintained a low vacancy rate at 1.63%, while private non-regulated units were vacant at a 5.6% rate. The HVS reports that overcrowding varies by rent regulation status, with the highest rates among the stabilized stock. Overall, 12.2% of all rental housing in New York City is overcrowded. That is, there is more than one person per room on average, and 4.7% is severely overcrowded. That is, there is an average of over 1.5 persons per room. Pre-war stabilized housing is most crowded, with 15.0% overcrowded and 6.1% severely overcrowded, while post-war units are overcrowded at a rate of 14.6% and severe overcrowding is at a 5.5% rate. Private, non-regulated housing is slightly less overcrowded at 11.3%, with 4.2% severely overcrowded. As this pie chart illustrates, about two-thirds of New York City's occupied housing stock is renter-occupied. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals, 39%, followed by pre-war stabilized, 35%, other regulated units at 13%, post-war stabilized, 12%, and rent-controlled units, 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new dwelling units in 2014 increased by 13.8% to 20,483, the fifth consecutive year of increase, but still 13,000 units less than 2008 levels. Permits rose in 3 of the 5 boroughs, including Queens, which rose by the most proportionally, up 55.0% to 4,900 units. Manhattan also saw an increase in permits, up 11.9% to 5,435 units, while permits issued in Brooklyn rose 23.0% to 7,551 permits. and permits in Staten Island fell by 40.7% to 712 units. Permits also fell in the Bronx by 28.5% to 1,885 units. First quarter 2015 permits increased by 21.2% in comparison to the number of permits issued during the first quarter of 2014, including levels which more than doubled in Brooklyn, rising 107.2%, and also rising significantly in the Bronx, up 48.0%. But declining in Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island by 36.2%, 26.7%, and 7.4% respectively. You can see from this graph that residential building permits increased 13.8%, but are still 13,000 units less than the peak in 2008 seen in this graph. While the city overall had a 13.8% increase in permits to 20,483 citywide, this map shows the number of permits by borough in 2014 and the change from 2013. As already noted, permits rose by double digits in Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn, but fell by double digits in the Bronx and Staten Island. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings applying for permits. In 2014, a total of 1,513 buildings received permits. Citywide, 35.8% of these buildings were single-family, 25.3% were two-family, 11.6% were three- or four-family structures, and 27.4% were buildings with 5 or more units. As this chart illustrates, almost all building permits in Manhattan were for the largest buildings, while in Staten Island, virtually all permits were for either 1 or 2 family buildings. Building size was more evenly distributed in the other boroughs. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of housing units actually completed in a given year, which in 2014 decreased. In 2014, there were 11,867 new housing completions citywide, a 6.4% decrease over the prior year. Decreases were seen in 2 of the 5 boroughs, including Manhattan, which fell by 28.6%, and Queens, which fell by 23.2%. But completions rose in the other boroughs, including Brooklyn, which rose by 13.6%, and the Bronx, up 30.5%, as well as Staten Island, up 10.0%. New housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Housing Development Corporation. Through programs like the Multifamily Housing Rehabilitation Loan Program and the Mitchell-Lama Preservation Program, these agencies reported 8,797 housing starts in fiscal year 2014, 57% of which were rehabilitations, and a decrease of 42.8% over fiscal year 2013.
Danielle, can we take just 1 second so Harvey can enter present for the roll call?
Present.
Thank you.
The 421A program is designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners are exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. Exemptions last for 10 to 25 years, and rental properties must abide by all rent regulations during benefits. Participation has been rather variable in recent years, with both significant increases and decreases. But for the 3rd consecutive year, the number of new 421A exemptions fell, decreasing 12.0%. A total of 6,945 units newly received 421A benefits in 2014, with 31.8% of those units in Brooklyn and 31.7% in Manhattan, while 22.4% of units were in Queens. The Bronx contained 14.1% of the units newly receiving 421A benefits, and no units in Staten Island newly received 421A benefits. Newly certified 421A units went down in every borough but the Bronx and Queens during 2014, although the number of rental units did increase citywide by 14.5%, including a doubling of rental units in Manhattan. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving 421A benefits in 2014 decreased for the third consecutive year, but rates are still higher than many other recent years. To meet demand in the housing market, office buildings and manufacturing space are sometimes converted into residential housing, or a residential building is subdivided into additional units. In addition, a number of SRO building owners have filed to convert their buildings to other uses, such as tourist hotels. In 2014, 108 of these applications were accepted, down 21 applications from the 129 filed during the prior year. More than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. Construction of new co-ops and condos, which increase the supply of owner-occupied housing, and the conversion of rental housing to co-op or condo status, which reduces the supply of rental housing, have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. The number of co-op and condo plans filed in 2014 with the Attorney General increased 40.5%, with a total of 267 plans containing 9,573 units, an 82.5% increase in units. This is the third consecutive year of increase in accepted co-op and condo units. Similar to recent years, a majority of the 2014 plans were for new construction, a total of 5,155 new units in 210 plans, and 3,956 units in 20 plans were for non-eviction conversions, with the remaining 462 units in rehabilitation plans. The majority of plans accepted were located in Brooklyn, with 56% of the share of accepted co-op and condo plans. And the majority of units within these plans were located in Manhattan, with 67% of the share of units citywide. As this graph shows, the number of accepted units in co-op and condo plans increased for the third consecutive year. The blue bar represents the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the green bars are accepted co-op units. In 2014, almost all accepted units were condos. Another tax abatement and exemption program available to owners has been the J51 Program. J51 was designed to encourage rehabilitation of residential units. As with the 421A program, J51 benefits are available to both rental as well as owner-occupied units. Eligible activities include MCIs, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, and conversion from non-residential use if substantial government assistance is provided. 40,787 units were newly approved for J51 benefits in 2014, a 26.7% decrease from the prior year. While citywide, the number of newly approved J51 units fell, at the borough level, increases were seen in Brooklyn, which rose 115.0%, and in Staten Island, which rose 56.1%. In the Bronx, the number of newly approved units fell 70.1% and fell by 16.5% in Manhattan and 11.8% in Queens. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 1992. As you can see, levels decreased 27% in 2014. Another part of the city's housing stock are those buildings that the city has taken title to in the past for the non-payment of taxes. The city in recent years has developed new policies to deal with the non-payment of taxes, including anti-abandonment and third-party transfer programs. In the meantime, it continues to divest itself of the buildings it already owns, and since 1994 has reduced the number of vacant and occupied in-rent housing by at least 98.3%. leaving a total of just 762 units managed by the city by the end of fiscal year 2014, down from a peak of almost 100,000 units in 1986. This is a decrease of 1.7% over the prior fiscal year. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of buildings which are demolished each year, which increased in 2014 for the second consecutive year, rising 17.7% to reach 1,513 buildings. By borough, Queens had 36.7% of all buildings demolished in 2014, a rise of 22.5%. Brooklyn had a 30.0% share, a rise of 23.7%. Staten Island accounted for 17.1% of building demolitions, a rise of 19.4%. The Bronx had an 8.3% share, a rise of 19.0%. And Manhattan had the smallest share of buildings demolished, 8.0%, a fall of 16.6%. So in conclusion, the number of building permits increased by 13.8%, but are still 13,000 units below 2008 levels, while housing units completed decreased by 6.4% to 11,867 units, and the in-rent housing stock decreased. In addition, 82.5% more units were approved for co-ops and condos, but 12.0% less units were built with 421A tax incentives, while 26.7% less units were rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives, but demolitions increased, rising by 17.7%. And the vacancy rate was 3.45%, less than the 5% legal threshold required for the continuation of rent stabilization. If there are any questions?
Any questions?
I'm really interested in this kind of increase in demolition requests. Can you determine from the demolition requests how many of those had stabilized units in it before the demolition request happened?
I don't think so. I can ask for the raw data, but it would be difficult to, even if I got the raw data, it would be difficult to correlate it, and I don't think it would be done. By the time I would ask for it and then get it and correlate it, I don't think it would be done before the vote, but I can ask.
Yeah, I mean, it might be interesting to ask from HCR about with such increases in demolition requests. I know they're not coming today, but I'm wondering if we've seen such an increase in demolition. Is it one and two family homes, or are they buildings with stabilized units that are being demolished for some other use?
Yeah, I'd be curious on the back end if the demolitions were related to rezonings and if 421A or J51s were used, if there was a net increase. I don't know. But and it could be commercial or residential properties, right? Demolitions
Yes.
is across the board. Yeah.
Can you speak into the mic? Thanks.
You can't, because of demolition, kick people out.
Of course you can, Scott. You apply to HCR to request that you're demolishing the building, even though it's got rent-stabilized units in it, and the HCR approves the demolition request and kicks out all the rent-stabilized tenants. It happens all the time. And with such an increase in demolition requests, it'd be interesting to see how many of this is related to these stabilized units. I guess the question then to Andrew, maybe we can, if HCR does come in the future, maybe we can add on this conversation around demolition.
I mean, I could ask them, I mean, we could certainly ask them for the number of requests that they've had for demolitions in terms of rent
The
stabilization.
requests and approvals, over the last 5 years, and we see there's an uptick. And we have to know how many stabilized units, if it's one unit in a building versus a larger number in these individual buildings.
I have a question. We see all these conversions for co-ops and condos. Do we have an idea of how many of these will be sold with subsidy in mind per borough?
I'm sorry, how many were what?
The conversion that's going to happen for co-ops and condos. Do we have an idea whether they're going to be, will these have subsidies?
I think the majority of, the vast majority are private plans.
Private
We do
plans.
sometimes get some from HPD, which maybe would involve some sort of subsidy. I don't think there's an exact way to know, but I would highly, highly doubt that any or most would have a subsidy.
Yeah, I mean, it would be easy to find out, isn't it? Because the Attorney General either approves it as a no-action plan on a subsidized affordable co-op or condo versus a market rate where they have an offering plan.
I don't report on no-action plans. I only report on the conversions or the new construction.
No-action plans are conversions, they're just low-income conversions.
That's not, the way I've heard it from them, they give me certain data, I'd have to see exactly what data they gave me, but based on conversations with them, it's very difficult from the data they give me to sort out exactly which ones actually are conversions and which ones, sometimes they approve things that are just like for, like a new sidewalk, or, it's very confusing, but there's no way to pull out exactly which of the ones that say no action or HOA, sometimes they say that. It's very confusing, but that's the data I get from them, and there's no way to pull it out.
I mean, Erica McHale supervises the division that deals with the low-income co-ops, the HDFCs. So they have to approve it through that division, so they would know every year how many are new construction condo or co-op versus new conversion condo or co-ops versus HDFC condo or co-op. They approve them, so they must have the data. So the data would be useful to know how many stabilized buildings that have stabilized units in them are converting, or are those all just new construction condos that are being built?
Yeah, but a building can convert with rent-stabilized units and have nothing to do with HDFC.
That's right. So but if this is all new construction and they're all new construction condos, there are no stabilized units in the buildings.
It's not all new construction. In the report, it quantifies exactly what's construction and exactly what's conversion.
So the conversion could have stabilized units, and the Attorney General would know that number.
I don't know exactly what they know.
I think, Harvey, if you looked at Appendix 5 on page 18, I'm not sure if this is going to give you the information that you're looking at, but it might at least break down some of the information that you're looking at, that you're interested in.
So the only data we don't have is how many had stabilized units at the time of conversion. That data.
I
you
can
don't have.
ask them if they have that data.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Danielle.
Good morning. I'll present the changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock report, looking at 2014. Rent regulation has been a fixture in New York City's housing market for over 7 decades, although the laws that govern rent-regulated housing have been substantially changed and modified over time, including most recently with the passage of the Rent Act of 2011. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. Units enter, exit, or change status within the regulatory system. This report is an update of previous studies we've done annually since 2003. These totals do not represent every unit that has been added or subtracted from the rent-stabilized stock, but rather those that have been recorded or registered by various city and state agencies. They represent a floor or minimum count of the actual number of newly regulated and deregulated units in each year. Since newly constructed or substantially rehabilitated units are exempt from rent regulation, increases to the regulated housing stock are often a result of owners voluntarily placing these new units under rent stabilization. Events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include the following: Section 421A Tax Exemption Program, J51 Property Tax Exemption and Abatement Program, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to rent-stabilized units, and rent-controlled apartments converting to rent stabilization. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a significant impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. Apartments newly created with the aid of these programs must typically remain rent stabilized for the duration of their benefits. In 2014, 3,110 units were added to the stabilized stock through the 421A program. That's 48% fewer than in the prior year. The largest number of units were in Manhattan, 1,371, followed by Brooklyn with 1,106, Queens, 417, and the Bronx, 216. There weren't any on Staten Island. And according to DHCR, the median legal rent of registered rent-stabilized apartments currently receiving 421A tax abatements in 2014 was $3,559. The J51 program added 243 units to the stabilized stock in 2014. That's 40% fewer than in the prior year. These newly renovated units receiving J51 benefits were located in two buildings in Staten Island, one building in Brooklyn, and one building in Queens. The 420C program, which provides tax exemptions for low-income housing projects, added 5,279 units to the stabilized stock in 2014. That was up from 1,967 in 2013. Of the total 420C units that were added, 54% were in the Bronx, 19% were in Manhattan, 16% were in Brooklyn, and 10% were in Queens, and there were none on Staten Island. Other additions...
The rents in the 420C, what were their average rents?
Oh, that's not available from DHCR. Other additions in 2014 include lofts converted to stabilized status, which added 21 units, down from 26 in the prior year. There were 318 Mitchell-Lama rental units that became rent stabilized versus none the prior year. And 211 units were decontrolled and became rent stabilized, down 32% from the prior year. So summing up all of the additions we've discussed, there was a total of 9,182 units added to the rent-stabilized housing stock in 2014, 6% more than in the prior year. Of these newly registered rent-stabilized apartments in 2014, the median legal regulated rent was $2,970. Now we'll move on to the subtraction.
I got to ask another question. How do you get that 2,900 number if we don't know 5,000 units out of the 9,000 what their rents were?
Well, we have all the units that entered rent stabilization, but the DHCR does not collect data on that 420C program, so they can't break it out.
So we're missing over 5,000 units from that number.
They're included, but they just don't report on the DHCR registration form whether they're 420C.
Just a quick question, Brian, I'm sorry I didn't ask this earlier. Is there any breakdown of the median rents by borough? Because obviously that median rent includes Manhattan, Bronx.
Yes, we do have that available.
If we could provide that, that would be great, thanks.
Sure.
And I'm sorry I didn't ask for that before.
That's okay.
So, just one other question, Brian. Since the J51, or so the 4,000 units, you said the median rent was 3,500, and the median rent for the all 9,000 were 2,900. It has to be lower than the 3,500.
The 421A, that was not initial. That was for currently registered as 421A, so it's a different universe.
Okay.
Okay, now we'll move on to...
I think it's important to note it's the legal registered rent. Not the charge or actual rent.
Now we'll move on to the subtraction of units from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of physical changes to the dwellings. Events that lead to the removal of stabilized units include high rent, high income deregulation, high rent vacancy deregulation, co-op condo conversions, expiration of 421A benefits and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other losses to the housing stock, such as from demolitions, condemnations, apartment mergers, etc. The largest number of subtractions from the rent-stabilized stock were due to high rent vacancy deregulation, which since June of 2011 occurs when the legal regulated rent of an apartment can reach $2,500 or more after being vacated. According to DHCR rent registration records of those owners who filed, at least 6,235 units were deregulated in 2014 under high rent vacancy deregulation. That's up 30% from the number deregulated the prior year, and it represents 69% of all units removed from rent stabilization in 2014. The other type of deregulation that occurs is high rent, high income deregulation, when the rent reaches $2,500 and household income exceeds $200,000. High rent, high income deregulation removed 186 apartments in 2014, up 46% from the prior year. This graph shows the minimum number of units that have left the stabilized stock over the past 2 decades, since state law first permitted deregulation of units with rents above $2,000 upon vacancy, or $2,500 since June of 2011. The graph shows the increase that occurred annually from 2000 until 2009, followed by decline for 4 years, but then an increase again this past year. During this entire period, a minimum of 139,408 units were registered with DHCR as being deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation. This graph shows the number of units that left the stabilized housing stock due to high rent, high income deregulation since 1994. Over this period, at least 5,984 units have been deregulated due to high rent, high income deregulation. In every year except 2009 and 1994, which was the initial year that high rent, high income deregulation was permitted, the number of units registered as deregulated due to high rent, high income has been under 400 units each year, including this past year when 186 units were deregulated. Apartments left rent stabilization for other reasons. Co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings, totaled 789 units, up 2% from the prior year. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in 1,011 units removed from stabilization, up 34% from the prior year. The expiration of J51 benefits resulted in a total of 137 units removed, 27% fewer than in the prior year. 226 units were removed from stabilization due to substantial rehabilitation. That's down 27% from the prior year as well. In addition, 13 units were converted to non-residential use. That's down from 31 units in the prior year. Other losses to the stabilized housing stock, such as the merger of pre-existing units or demolition, resulted in 416 additional units leaving the stabilized housing stock. That's 32% fewer than in the prior year.
Brian, of the 416, how many are demolitions?
We don't receive the data broken down from DHCR. Summing up the subtractions, a minimum of 9,013 units left rent stabilization in 2014. That's up 19% from the prior year. So looking at the sum of both additions and subtractions to the stabilized stock in 2014, the study found an estimated net gain of 169 units to the stabilized housing stock in 2014. The vast majority of additions to the stabilized stock were the result of tax incentive programs. 420C units received 57% of the additions, and 421A units equaled 34%. Meanwhile, high rent vacancy deregulation was the largest source of measured subtractions from the stabilized stock in 2014, accounting for 69% of the total number of subtractions. This table shows the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2014. It includes 9,182 additions to the stabilized stock and 9,013 units removed from stabilization. Taking the difference between the two, it results in a net gain to the stabilized stock of 169 units. This graph shows the net change in the total number of apartments removed from stabilization since 2003, which is the first year that the RGB prepared this report and has annual data through the most recent year, 2014. The study found this past year a net gain of 169 rent-stabilized units in 2014. It was the second gain since we began collecting this data. I will now take any additional questions you may have.
It might be useful for us all to look at page 13 that shows the subtractions from stabilized housing stock due to high rent vacancy deregulation by borough, just because that's obviously important for us to think about when we just think about the overall loss of units from the most significant cause of the loss of units, which is obviously the high rent vacancy deregulation. So again, I would just draw everyone's attention to page 13. Brian, I don't know if you want to just briefly go over those numbers, but I think that would be useful.
I actually have a question. Is it possible for you guys to put something together where we see the increases, the adjustments that were made by the board in correlation to some of these numbers to see if there's any...
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question.
To get the adjustments that were passed by the board every year after year, for me to see somehow that and this in the same, I don't know, together. Does that make sense?
The adjustments meaning the...
whatever the board passed every June?
As in the rent increases?
Yes. And then
we do have a convenient PDF chart that we can print out for you that has all the guidelines on from the beginning.
I want to overlay it on it so that I can see it, see if there's any, if our increases, how do that affect the market, what we see in the vacancy, in the amount of units that are deregulated. Does that make sense? I don't know if that, it's just for me to have an idea.
Yeah, no, we can do that.
Yeah.
I think, we can give you the 1 and 2 year guideline, but we do also do the rent index, which combines that. That would probably be the best percentage because it includes what we think.
I feel like we get that later.
The rest.
I'm sorry, you want the guidelines to overlay which chart?
Net losses.
Oh, this graph? Okay. Okay, going back to 2003, sure.
Well, on the loss of condo and co-op units, do you know that's the loss because of new co-op and condo conversions, or the loss of existing co-op and conversions, or units are being removed from regulation because the existing stabilized tenant is moving out?
It's both. It includes any units that, if it converts and it's still rent stabilized, it would not be reflected until they actually leave the unit.
Well, at the time of conversion, the people who are stabilized in the building who become owners, those units come out of stabilization.
Then they would show up in this. Anything that leaves rent stabilization, as long as they file a deregulation form with the HCR, it would show up.
And then I'm just wondering how that compares to Danielle's data, which says that 3,500 units in 2014 were converted. I'm wondering how we compare this number of 789 and that number of 3,500. How do we...
It's a different universe because those include all units that file plans.
So you're saying in their buildings, if we know the size of the building, they can be smaller units that become co-op or condo?
I mean, there are units that are converted that were free market units, so that would be included in the plans.
Brian, to go back to Rachel's, if you could just read out the Table 4, the summary is there over time for each borough.
Oh, for each borough, you want me to, okay, this
Yeah.
is the high rent vacancy deregulation by borough. You mean for the total or just for 2014?
Just for 2014.
Okay. Okay, well, there were the most in Manhattan, 3,572 units, followed by Brooklyn with 1,247 units, Queens, 1,056 units, the Bronx, 309 units, and 51 units on Staten Island. A total of 6,235 units were deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation in 2014.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so again, I think we noted that we will be receiving the information, breaking down the median by borough of the rents, that we think that would be useful for us to have.